I was staying with my brother at a cabin in northern Montana. The place was nestled deep in a dip between the mountains, tucked away among the trees. Both my brother, Johnny, and I were pretty outdoorsy, so this kind of trip was nothing new for us. Hiking, exploring, and just being out in the woods. Because of the long drive up, we spent our first day taking it slow, hanging around the cabin and soaking in the scenery without venturing too far. Around 5:30 p.m., Johnny decided to go for a walk before it got dark. I barely looked up from the couch as he walked out the door, just muttering, "All right." He didn't bring a backpack or any gear, so I assumed it was just a quick stroll. I stayed back, lying on the couch near the fireplace, still exhausted from driving most of the day. Slowly, the cabin began to darken as the sun slipped behind the mountains. It wasn't until the only light left came from the flickering fireplace that I realized Johnny still hadn't returned. By now, it was far too dark to be wandering around without gear. I jumped up, grabbed my day pack, my headlamp, and a flashlight, and headed out to find him. My first thought was bears. We were in bear country, after all, and the idea of Johnny running into one made me nervous. But as I pushed deeper into the woods along the trail, that nervousness shifted into something else. I kept glancing over my shoulder, getting the strange, creeping sense that someone was behind me. Each time I looked, the trail was empty, but the feeling didn't go away. About 10 minutes down the trail, I finally saw Johnny. He was coming toward me, moving fast, not sprinting, but definitely with urgency, like he was trying to get away from something. We both started talking at once, me asking what was going on, and him telling me to turn around and head back to the cabin. Without another word, we fell into a fast walk back, slamming the door shut once we were inside. That's when he told me. Out there, in the trees, someone had been watching him. He said the man looked strange, creepy, and as Johnny kept walking, it seemed like the figure was stalking him along the trail. Johnny thought that if he just walked back to the cabin while it was still daylight, the man might follow him. So he waited until it was dark to come back. Being the older brother, Johnny assured me it was probably nothing. He said he was just being cautious rather than paranoid. I trusted him and tried to push the worry out of my head. Maybe the guy he'd seen just had another cabin nearby, or was on his own hike. We made dinner and then sat out on the front porch for the rest of the night, next to a crackling campfire. I think both of us were secretly keeping watch for anyone lurking in the trees, but neither of us said it out loud. The mountains grew quieter as the night went on. We talked until late, then finally went inside and slept until morning. After a quick breakfast, we packed our bags for the main hike in the area, a long trek up one of the mountain peaks. It took about 6 hours, and by the time we were heading back to the cabin, we were both completely exhausted. The last hour of the walk felt like it dragged on forever. As soon as we got inside, Johnny tossed his bag down and said he was going to take a shower. I dropped onto the couch to wait. The cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom, so I'd have to wait my turn. I'd only been lying there for a minute when I remembered the guy Johnny had told me about the day before. I stood up and looked out the windows, half expecting to see someone out there in the trees. Nothing. Still, the uneasiness lingered. I sat back on the couch, but the feeling only grew stronger. After a few minutes, I realized something was off. The obnoxious sound of the water pump for the shower hadn't started. "Johnny," I called. No response. I got up and walked slowly down the hall toward the bedroom. Knocking on the door, I said his name again. Something inside me tightened with dread as I reached down and cracked the door open. Through the narrow gap, I saw Johnny kneeling in the corner of the room. His eyes were wide open, staring at me, subtly shaking his head, "No," silently begging me not to come in. The sheer terror on his face burned into my memory. I pushed the door open a few more inches, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing just a few feet from Johnny. His eyes were wide too, but in a strange, vacant way. His clothes were torn and filthy. Long, oily black hair hung down over his face. He looked feral. I didn't even have time to think. Pure instinct kicked in. I charged at him. Only as I closed the distance did I see the gun in his hand. But by then, it was too late to stop. I slammed into him. Johnny sprang into action immediately. Together, we wrestled the gun away from him and got him mostly under control. The man was screaming, a raw, animalistic screech, clawing and thrashing to get free. I'd never seen anything like it. He wouldn't stop fighting. We had to figure out how to get out fast. Johnny, being bigger than me, held him down while I ran outside to get the car ready. I threw our bags inside. They were still packed from the hike, started the engine, and then rushed back in. We tied him up with whatever we could find, just enough to keep him down long enough to escape. And of course, we took the gun with us. We could still hear his screams echoing from inside the cabin as we drove away into the night. Once we reached cell service, we called the police. By the time they arrived at the cabin, the man was gone. All that remained were the torn-up scraps of fabric we'd used to tie him down. Later, Johnny told me what had happened. When he went into the room to shower, the man had been waiting with the gun, ordering him to call me inside. Johnny refused, knowing it would put me in danger. But then I walked in on my own. We still talk about how insane it was that I tackled the guy. Honestly, I can't even explain why I did it. But maybe that instinct saved both our lives. The only clue authorities have is the gun we handed over. It was registered to a man who'd been missing for 5 years, from about 50 miles away. But the description of the man who attacked us didn't match the registered owner. It's likely whoever ambushed us also ambushed the gun's owner, making him a missing person. And if anything had gone differently, Johnny and I might have ended up the same way. Story 2 by PL. In 2016, I made a trip to my father's old cabin. It was 6 hours away, hidden deep in the woods outside the town he grew up in, or what used to be a town. By then, it was nothing more than a row of abandoned buildings and shuttered stores lining a deserted road. We had rarely visited the cabin when I was younger. My father always said there wasn't much reason to go once the town died. But after he passed away, I felt drawn to it. I wanted to see the home he'd built with his own hands, to stand where he once stood. I knew it would be in rough shape, but my plan was to restore what I could, to keep it standing a little longer. If nothing else, I hoped the trip would clear my head and give me some peace and quiet. I drove down, parked my car behind one of the abandoned gas stations, and started the thin, rugged trail that wound 2 miles through the forest to the cabin. My pack was heavy, backpacking gear and the tools I'd need for repairs, and a part of me wondered if I'd even find it still standing. I had a tent just in case. After the long trek, I finally reached the clearing. To my relief, the cabin was still there. A simple, rectangular log home with vines and greenery crawling up the outer walls. It stood quietly among the trees, like a forgotten relic. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the place was worse than I expected. Trash was scattered across the floor, and a damp, musty smell hung in the air. It was clear someone had discovered the cabin at some point and squatted there, though it looked like no one had been around for at least a couple of years. I moved what debris I could into a corner to make a small, clear space, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. I should mention, though I didn't hear or see anything unusual, I couldn't sleep for more than 30 minutes at a time without waking up. A strange, creeping feeling kept pulling me out of sleep. No noise, no movement, just an unshakable sense that something wasn't right. By sunrise, I was groggy and starting to regret the trip. I made coffee on my camping stove and decided to take a walk to clear my head. The forest was still dim, the sun only just beginning to pierce the treetops. A little ways in, I found an overlook, a small hill where the trees thinned out and you could see above the canopy. It seemed like the perfect spot to watch the sunrise. But instead, I found something else. From the hilltop, I could see the abandoned town far off in the distance. Most of it was just dark outlines against the fading night, but one thing caught my eye. A faint light flickering from a window in one of the buildings. It was too far to tell if it came from an old house or a store. Then, just a minute later, it shut off. Instantly. A part of me worried about my car sitting back there. But mostly, I was just shocked. The place was supposed to be empty. Maybe it was just urban explorers passing through, I told myself. Still, it felt like an awfully big coincidence. I stayed on that hill for about an hour, watching the sunrise. When the sky turned fully blue, I headed back through the woods and got to work on the cabin. The first order of business was sealing the gaps and cleaning up the outside. But that feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. It stuck with me, crawling up the back of my neck whenever I turned my head. Every time I glanced at the woods, that eerie sense pressed down on me. It took me a while to put it into words, but eventually, I understood what it was. I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept working, but my eyes darted over my shoulder again and again. The possibility of anyone else being out there seemed absurd. The town, sure, but not here. Not in these random woods with nothing but a decaying cabin. I told myself I was just on edge. When the sun dipped low, I went inside and tested the old wood stove. To my relief, it roared to life without a problem, warming the cabin like it had in my father's time. I sat down in front of it, watching the flames dance, the crackle and hiss filling the silence. I thought about my dad, about the trip, about life in general. But sometime later that night, the comforting crackles of the fire were joined by something else. Cracks, crunching, footsteps from the front of the cabin. I turned my head and held my breath, listening. It wasn't an animal. The sound was steady, deliberate, a person. As they reached the front door, the fire suddenly seemed 1,000 times louder, making it hard to focus on the noise outside. Then came the knock, and a voice. It called out a name, my father's name. And in that moment, my whole world stopped. It was like something took hold of me, pulling me to my feet, guiding me toward the door in a daze. My mind spun. How did this stranger know my dad's name? I couldn't stop myself from calling out, asking who he was. There was a pause. Then the man answered. I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin. Was hoping I'd get to see him again. His voice was calm, measured. I stepped closer to the door, fighting the urge to open it, to sit with someone who might have known my dad, to hear stories I'd never been told. But something deep down held me back. Why was he here now? I asked, and he said he lived in the abandoned town down the road. After a moment's hesitation, I told him the truth, that I was my father's son, and that my dad had passed away. The man was quiet for a second before replying. I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time. At first those words felt almost comforting, but then a knot twisted in my stomach. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. Not sadness, not grief, just flat, empty, almost like he was pretending. Before I could even respond, he spoke again, cutting into my thoughts. Why don't you open up and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire. His tone was slow, but underneath, I could feel an urgency, a push, like he was running out of patience. The longer I stood there, the less I believed him. Sure, he knew my dad's name, sure, he said he lived in the town. But how did I know he was really a friend? Something inside me screamed that he wasn't telling the truth. I stayed silent too long. He spoke again, sharper now. Then came another knock, louder, harsher. The softness in his voice slipped away. Open the door, kid. I backed away, step by step. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you? My heart hammered against my ribs. I dug through my backpack and wrapped my hand around my hunting knife. The man's voice grew angrier. He struck the door, shaking the frame, hurling threats between words, his mask of friendliness completely gone now. The pounding echoed through the cabin. Time warped. I don't know how long it lasted, only that it felt endless, like being trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. And then, silence. A final slam against the door, followed by the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. I stayed frozen until dawn, knife still clutched in my hand, my body aching from hours of waiting and listening. Only when the sun lit up the trees did I move. Throwing my gear into my pack, I bolted through the woods, hardly daring to breathe until I saw my car, still hidden behind the broken-down gas station. Untouched. I drove without stopping until I was home. I had gone there hoping for closure, to feel closer to my father, to understand the place he had once built. Instead, I left with more questions than ever. Why had my dad really left? I always assumed it was because the town was dying, the people disappearing. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe there were other reasons he never wanted me to find out. I don't know why that man was still out there, or what he really wanted from me, or even how he knew my dad at all. But something deep inside tells me his intentions that night weren't good. Had I let my emotions take over? Had I opened that door and invited him in? I don't think I'd be here to tell this story. I truly believe I would have vanished into that dying town, just another name whispered and forgotten in the woods. Story 3, by Anonymous. It was back in 2014, during my gap year from college, when I was traveling across the US out of my car. By the time I reached the East Coast, my cousin offered me his cabin, just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I jumped at the chance. An actual roof over my head sounded like a luxury after weeks on the road. The cabin wasn't what I expected. It wasn't some drafty old shack. It felt like a modern vacation home. Cozy, well kept, even a little upscale. I was surprised my cousin would let me stay there for free. As I unloaded my car, trip after trip, I suddenly noticed someone in the tree line. They were standing still, far from the path, just watching. With nothing else nearby but the cabin and me, it was clear their eyes were locked on me. Maybe it wasn't as creepy as it seemed, I told myself. I didn't know the area. Maybe there were other houses hidden past the trees. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Still, the hairs on my arms stood up. I grabbed the last of my stuff, locked my car, and hauled it inside. As I shut the door, I looked again. The man was still there, facing the cabin. I texted my cousin to let him know I'd arrived safely, but also mentioned the person outside, asking if he knew who it could be. Then I went about unpacking and, distracted, forgot to check for his reply. An hour passed. Darkness had fallen. I finally looked at my phone. My cousin's message read, "The cabin's on 40 acres of my property. There's a fence around the whole thing. Nobody should be out there." My stomach dropped. Before, I'd been uneasy. Now, I was scared. I walked back to the window and looked out. Beyond the glow of the cabin lights, there was only blackness. So dark, I couldn't even make out the tree line. It gave me a chill, and I yanked the curtains shut. I tried to calm down by watching a movie in the bedroom. For a while it worked, but the uneasy feeling never fully left. About an hour in, movement flickered at the edge of my vision. There was a gap in the curtains. I stared at it, heart thudding. Had something moved? All I could see now was my own blurry reflection in the glass, and nothing but endless dark behind it. I got up and started walking towards the window. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, sprinting through the grass. By the time I reached the window, the sound was already fading into the woods. I couldn't see a thing. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and called my cousin. I don't know why I didn't call the police right away, but he told me to. I hung up and dialed 911. For how isolated the cabin was, an officer arrived surprisingly quickly. But the man was long gone. Out here in the dark woods, there wasn't much the cop could do. He couldn't search the forest or track someone unless the man came back. And so, I was alone again. I thought about leaving, but the idea of carrying all my belongings back to the car, trip after trip, outside in the pitch-black night, that felt even worse. So I stayed. The uneasy feeling never left, not for 1 second. Of course, I couldn't stop looking out the windows over and over, even though there was nothing but darkness staring back at me. For the last hour before bed, I paced the cabin, double-checking doors and locks, trying to convince myself I was safe. It must have been around midnight, maybe 1 a.m., and I was just delaying the inevitable. I had to sleep at some point. I shut off every light, went into the bedroom, and locked myself in. I crawled under the blanket, hoping the worst was over, and after about 30 minutes, I finally drifted off. But I woke up again far too soon. The sun wasn't up yet. It had to be around 4 more a.m. I'd barely slept, but my mind was already back in that state of panic. There was no way I'd fall asleep again without checking the cabin. I slipped out of bed, turned on the hallway light, and just listened. Nothing. Only the wind pressing against the thin windows. I started walking down the hall, but froze halfway when I heard it. A couple of dull thumps from the far end of the cabin. That was where the small library and kitchen were. My breath caught as I crept closer. In the dim glow of the hallway light, a shadow moved. I stopped. The shadow stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then, slowly, it began to move again. And then I saw him. A figure stepped into view at the end of the hallway. The same man I'd seen out in the trees. Just the shape of him was enough for me to know. I spun around and bolted back into the bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. Silence. I expected pounding, screaming, the door splintering. But nothing came. Only the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, slow footsteps. They crept down the hall until they stopped right on the other side of the door. He was just standing there. I gripped my phone in my hand, ready to call for help, but terrified he'd hear me. Instead, adrenaline took over. I grabbed my keys, pushed open the bedroom window, and climbed out into the cold night. I ran to my car and sped away, not daring to look back. Later, when the cops arrived, they found no one. But they did find where he'd come in. A window at the far end with a broken lock. Whether he'd broken it, or it had been that way all along, no one could say. They also found the bedroom door wide open. The lock was just one of those weak push-pin types. He'd been ready to open it. He'd been right there. If I'd stayed and waited for the police, I probably wouldn't have gotten out so easily. And the worst part? He was there the moment I arrived at the cabin. That means he'd likely been watching the place for a while, waiting, maybe for me. What he really wanted, what he would have done if I'd opened the door, I was lucky enough never to find out.